Thank you for your comments. It's, very complex. A lot of what you said touched me in different ways. And one thing that I'll speak to, or I guess two things that I'll speak to in what you said was, talked about the restoration process, that's what I call it, for students, and how that student that you spoke about that had a physical hold, and how the damaging that could be. Something else that we have to be cognizant of with how students experience school is, the psychological trauma and implications for what it does to a person's psyche when you're placed on a failing school trajectory. When we look at the data and we see that even preschool, so you're 2 years old and you're 3 years old, and we know by research that Black students can do the exact same behavior. A Black student can do the exact same behavior as a white student. So it's not that Black students are misbehaving more, it's how their behavior is being interpreted. So, to my point quickly, if you are that child who, when you begin your educational career, at 2 years old, your behaviors are interpreted as being aggressive. You continue the trajectory with your school experiences, and you get physical holds, and then you get pushed out of school, and you get told all these awful things about your behavior. A critical missing component is that human restoration. Where do we in school as professionals restore those students that we deteriorate themselves? So we have to think about the student restoration, and that is a missing component. But in terms of a piece that what teachers can do that's not necessarily offered in any curriculum is research does show that critical self-reflection can be beneficial. Self-examination can be beneficial. But in terms of the actual teaching, I don't know of, in our program, when I think about our teacher prep program, I can't think of any specific class that really gets to some of the things that you mentioned.
I think a lot of it starts with awareness, because
Yeah.
like you said, that critical self-reflection, because we have research as early as like the preschool level that teachers are actually watching and looking for misbehavior more frequently with students of color. But and so the way, regardless of what students are doing, they're primed to see and find reasons to intervene for behaviors. And then we have an abundance of large-scale studies that really clearly show that, again, it's not about the behaviors. Right. So going back to those implicit assumptions about who's behaving, how and why, and what it means, I think is a really critical starting point. And I think it really needs to be infused across the spectrum. And so one thing with my group here that we started talking about is a lot of these prevention systems in and of themselves are not enough unless they're infused with this critical race perspective, because the systems are there. They tend to work fairly well for middle-class white students. But when we look, as you mentioned about PBIS, right, it's promising, but there's not data to support the suggestion that I wasn't aware of the effect on student behavior, but on the treatment of students. Exclusionary discipline procedures are applied less with, again, white students in general. But there's actually, for the little research that has actually considered racial differences, it either suggests that there's no change for students of color, or there's actually more exclusion, right, of students of color because of this assumed neutrality, but nothing about how we perceive behavior, understand behavior, teach behavior is neutral. It's all deeply culturally based. And so I think starting at that and infusing it across all of our training, it can't just be the diversity training, right, because it's about how do we engage with data. It's not enough to recognize that a disparity is there, but to disentangle why it's there. And so there have been different recommendations on how to do that. But at the most basic level, it has to be foundational to what we're doing across the board.
I think I'm glad you mentioned too, language matters. So the fact that educators would say, well, these kids might pollute a group, it's just things like that we all have to be aware of. Immigrant kids have tons of, odd things that people talk about around them as well. So I think that was really insightful that you mentioned that.
And when we look back, a lot of it, around the special ed piece too, we can trace it back to how disability versus behavior disorder was framed. And they used terminology of predation. And there were people there's one person in particular going all around the country discussing who needs to be kept out of special ed so that they can be suspended and expelled, and who should be identified with a disability, using language of lions and lambs and wolves, and so they were framing these kids who are we know who they were talking about, right? As being this dangerous, predatory element within the classrooms, and those. Even though those messages aren't literally front and center the way they were before, those basic ideas are still there. And part of that whole movement in the early 90s was actually to embed it within state policy and district policy. And so I think we're seeing certainly that was rooted in a longer term legacy, but just around that behavior piece in particular, that was what they were doing in this. It was a lawyer actually who was going around to states and districts and writing articles in educational journals, for instance, and about keeping those lions and wolves away from the little lambs who have to be protected from letting those kids in their classrooms. So, yeah. And one of the articles I linked in your slides, the wading through quicksand, if you're interested.
I've been thinking a lot about how to increase the number of teachers of color. And I've even seen these magazines around people of color, teacher of color, something like that. And I'm just that's really great. But then when you go and look at the entry salaries or the transitions that maybe professionals would think about by the time they even think teaching might be a good fit, it's just not possible to transition. Or the barriers to the classroom and versus the professional environment, you're oh, that's so draining or something. So I think what if there was a different model where if the school system shifted to more block scheduling, that professionals who want to connect with students and increase the representation in the classroom could actually do that. Right now, for example, if you had a block schedule of 3 days a week, maybe if on those other 2 days you could have a teacher come in and that's their time to teach for an hour or two or whatever it is, instead of just making a full commitment to teaching. So it's a part-time way to increase representation of teachers who are underrepresented in the teacher population. I think a lot of the behavior things you're describing are also very problematic to me because I see those same phrases being applied in professional settings actually to professionals of color. It's very triggering for me, and I know I'm trying to obviously I work here to talk about young people primarily and then following them across their development, but it's just really problematic because the same education system is producing the same framework that is then applied in work settings. And I also found it really interesting that there's if you don't have experiences where you can connect with people who are different from you, you will just dismiss their behavior as blaming them. So, I don't know. I want to thank you guys for your presentation, but I wanted to kind of throw that idea of restructuring the classroom day to allow people to teach part-time especially in primary school or other ways.
I hope you connect. So I was mentioning we have a Teacher of Color campaign, and Rose Chu is our fellow who's actually doing a lot of these convenings and talking to community about how it could look different. And then she's got a really cool way to bring together all these groups that challenge each other. So the TFAs with the colleges of education, but the conservative folks around school education trainings. So she brings them all together to come up with new solutions. So I hope you can join that group.
And also currently in the state of Minnesota, there's a coalition to increase the teachers of color and American Indian. And so there are active pushes, if you will, to increase teachers of color. Also districts, there's different districts in the state of Minnesota that I'm knowledgeable of, but I don't think I have permission to say who they are, but they've made concentrated efforts to hire more teachers of color. And then also in the legislature, there's been money set aside for grants for different entities to put forth effort to increase teachers of color. So it is a problem, and it is something that multiple agencies and people are trying to address. And I love your idea in terms of other ways and alternatives to get people of color in education to be in front of a diverse student body. So thank you for that.
I'd like to address kind of the even larger topic of intellectualism. So our society values a particular type of mind that exceeds in academic settings. And that mind and that body is racialized. However, that mind that may be talented at bringing warmth and love into a room is not valued equally to someone who can recite pi 1,000 places. Do you see what I'm saying? So how do we restructure how we talk about what talent is in a deeply, deeply ableist society, knowing also what we know about race? So that intersection, I think, is so important in how we value a human being based on their productivity and ability that we would narrowly define as good and bad. Just like to hear your comments on that.
I mean, I'll just say, I think it's an everyday challenge for all of us. I'll just tell you, yesterday I was putting together a slide of this idea of all the leaders of color that have done so much, and I was like, you know what, I never show people in wheelchairs. I just never do. You know, the society has taught me that. And then I don't check myself enough.
It's so deeply embedded, we don't even think about it.
Now, I don't have power, though. So I want to be very clear, and Robin DiAngelo in her White Fragility book makes very clear who has power in this society. And if I were to show you her slide on who actually decides resources and changing of curriculums, it's 80% white men. Okay, so that's a reflection that really we need to be courageous and hold folks accountable. And again, it's not, they may not want to be replicating this, but we have to talk about it. Just like this story in terms of how teachers actually feel re-traumatized in this society. That's hugely important. And it's almost like we shield certain people from those conversations. We can only do it with Oprah's book club. No. We need to put it in the middle of a conversation with the school board, even though, that dude's been running for 20 years because he used to be he used to be the high school football captain. Guess what? Now you're going to learn about Black and Latino women. And I mean, the men I've worked with have been like, whew, Jennifer, I'm so glad, we can finally talk about this. So I would say there's hope. I'm not saying that none of those decision makers want to talk about this, but I think approaching the conversation with different audiences is so important.
I think it gets back to what is the fundamental purpose of schooling? Right? And I think I probably frustrate my students and the folks who work with me because I think we like to say it's to educate and support all learners, but that's not what the system was developed for. Arguably, it's operating exactly as it was intended to. So then I think it gets back to asking, what is the function of education, for what purposes, for whom, and kind of deconstructing and reconstructing all of that. Because I think we see good traction when we start at kind of the micro level, but the decisions that are driving, coming from the highest levels, those are controlled by certain perspectives and voices.
That's true. And capitalism. Yes. So I love when the indigenous community says this is still our land, though, and so the U of M will do this. That you have to assert that power because we've helped build, every cultural community has helped build this community. And so even if a corporation might be able to show this check, I can show you what all of our cultural communities did to make this community thrive. And to use that kind of language in terms of our assets and what we built. I think I'm building this institution right now a little bit, right? I didn't write a check, but I did provide something today. I will write a check, but when I make some more money.
When I think about power at the micro and macro level, I believe as educators, we need to fully put into force our power that we have at the classroom level. We know that referrals, behavioral referrals, we know that begins in the classroom between teachers and students. So in terms of localized power, it's the teachers that have the power to influence sometimes the educational trajectory of students. And so when you talk about communication and you talk about measures of success, it's important to not have a plumb line of what success is, especially when you think about special education, and then we think about the different forms of participation, and then we think about different forms of communication and cultural assets that people bring with them. So in terms of contributions that you can make, that teachers can make, is educating themselves on different cultures and understanding different cultural forms of communication. It's also not labeling behavior, but understanding it. And I think it's also working to create space and opportunity for students to be successful in the classroom. And that's not, something that's just going to happen overnight.
And getting away from this default of pathologizing anything outside of what is typical or desirable, because we're still there. The language changes occasionally, but fundamentally, like anything outside of a certain, anything on the tails is deviant and treated as such. And so reframing that whole notion and moving away from, again, like we can't see pathology in anything that is remotely different.
Right. And I appreciated your language use of the word human beings, and not necessarily appreciating difference, but appreciating of each of us that all students bring with them into the classroom. And how do we do that? How do you do that as educators, as service providers?
As I think about like the ecosystem of this, something I've been thinking about a lot is education and how we're educating the people who are then going to go in and teach our kids. And I come from I'm in occupational therapy school right now, and just thinking about all the missed opportunities to do this work and push deeper. And I don't know what it's like in other programs, but I feel like we need to stop letting people skirt around these issues and get through school and never have even started doing this work. And one thing I've noticed is, it'll be like, oh, we suggest you go to this program because it'd be great. And the people who choose then to go to these optional programs that will deepen their knowledge on these topics are the same people you'll see at all the trainings, and people who don't want to push through and do the work continue to choose to not. And then we have this continuing problem, and we're not disrupting these cycles, and we're just allowing these things to perpetuate.
Yeah, I mean, that's my biggest message too, as far as like how policy happens and how those criteria for certifications and licensures, it's all overcomplicated on purpose, okay? You should go and voice, just two people having an opinion in any board decision-making can change the whole trajectory of the outcome. And people's experiences are the ones that challenge that, right? So you're gonna be in a lot of long, boring meetings, I can assure you. It's not as exciting as, I wanna go hear the same people that talk like me, but we gotta challenge ourselves to be in a profession and then shape the profession and shape racial equity in this country. It's gotta happen all at the same time. And I'll tell you, it also energizes you, right? Because you can go every day to your job and be like, oh, we never do this, Or you could say, you know what, I'm personally in the public policy field. I went to a talk last night, I was like, you know what, I need to get a little bit deeper in how other legislators are hearing about race in the law. They had a special hearing at William Mitchell. And again, I have stacks of books of this, but I want to observe how people take it in, how when you clap, things like that make a difference. So we have to attend those, and especially right now in this country. Just challenge yourself. Like my next challenge is to go to an environmental committee meeting. I don't know if I want to sit through that. But I know that we only have 12 years, right? And so I owe that to kids in my family. So just challenging us to get in public policy, it's not, they overcomplicate it. All of us, it's a democracy, we still have one. So we got to go to these meetings.
Just a comment about the qualification. I'm working at Ghana, with the Center for African America. One of our strategies is to go together with the parents when they go to school, they go them to school when the kids have their IEP, and they call them for anything. So we just go together with the parents together. It really helps us because just give an example. One of the parents came in and said that, the school was in IEP, but the kid was every time good at school, but one of the students was calling him low level English. And then the kid talked to the parents, and the parents talked to the teacher, but he never said anything about that. Until one day, the other kid tell his friend, like, you are white, but I know that white is this paper, you are not white. So the other kid started crying, like it was a big deal. They called the parent like 100 times. You have to show up at school. The other kid or something. So we went together with the kids at school, and then just when the teacher and all the school people were there, they saw like 5 people coming together. The language changed. The way they have to talk of the kid changed. And then, it's helped like to do advocacy for those kids and stuff like that. So even when they give some of the parents don't know, they give them some papers like you need to sign here. When the parents sign, it's like they put the kid away, like behavior very bad, need to put in a special education, something like that. So we ask the parents not to send in the papers if you don't see the paper. So it's one of the strategies that help us to advocate and fight against some of the behaviors
I think it's always important, as we heard Dr. Sullivan say earlier, to involve families, to involve parents, and to really work together between schools and teachers, or between schools and families. That's important.